For some inexplicable reason, Ivan's father reading the newspaper popped into his mind. He remembered how his dad would snap the paper open, creating a sharp sound followed by the soft rustle of pages, signaling he had found an interesting article to share. It was an unconscious habit that drew everyone's attention. As Ivan closed his Kindle, he wished it could create a similar sound. Even snapping its case produced only a dull thud. He glanced at his wife, Samantha, who remained engrossed in her Kindle, not acknowledging him. After a loud sigh and receiving no response, he announced he was going for a drive. Samantha, deep into a historical novel about Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't reply. Ivan settled into his old sedan, unsure where to go, and stared at the garage door through the rain on his windshield. After 5 minutes, he decided to head to the local mall, despite his reluctance to navigate through crowds of teenagers on a wet fall day. The traffic was heavy, and it felt like everyone had forgotten how to drive in the rain. Arriving at the mall, he noted the packed parking lot and parked at the far end, avoiding the frantic search for a closer spot. Dreading the walk through the drizzle, he donned his jacket, feeling cold and damp by the time he reached the entrance. The air inside the mall was warm but had an unpleasant odor reminiscent of damp clothes drying. As he wandered, he occasionally glanced at store displays, feeling underwhelmed by the women's clothing that seemed unflattering. Stumbling upon a coffee shop, he joined the line behind young customers ordering complicated drinks. When it was his turn, he simply asked for a small coffee with milk, only to be informed the smallest size was medium. After a frustrating exchange, he paid a small fortune for a plain coffee and settled at a table outside the shop, hoping it would warm him. While sipping the too-hot drink, Ivan began people watching. He was struck by the sight of young women who were either significantly overweight or underweight, and the prevalence of tattoos among teenagers, which he believed should be illegal until they were old enough to understand the implications. 10 years prior, his daughter had roamed the mall, leading to arguments over her clothing and makeup. He recalled the importance she placed on how others perceived her, knowing the teenage drama would eventually pass. As he observed the girls, he contemplated the challenges their parents faced, aware that one day these girls would grow into women and forge their own paths in life. He looked at the women who were closer to his age, late 40s. It was depressing to think that these were the same women who had been so vibrant, sexy, and alive just 20 years earlier. It was as if they had given up on being attractive. Short hair, no makeup, loose shirts, and stretch pants that left nothing to the imagination. Unfortunately, his wife had adopted the same fashions. He sipped his coffee. It had cooled enough to be drinkable, while he'd been watching people walk by. The women weren't the only ones who had forgotten how to look good. The men were overweight as well, wearing wrinkled pants with loose shirts that hid their substantial guts. He looked down and sighed. He wasn't ready to be on the cover of GQ magazine himself. He had never thought about how much life inside the house had revolved around the children until after they were gone. The conversations had all focused on what the kids were doing right or wrong, their plans, their dreams, and just the general drama of being young and exploring the world for the first time. His wife had planned all activities around the kids. Without them at home, there was nothing to talk about. His daughter, Molly, had moved out of the house 4 months ago. That had been a big deal, encompassing 3 months of talking about it, weeks of apartment hunting, and more weeks of shopping. His wife had been in the middle of it all, buying housewarming presents, both practical and impractical. Ivan was surprised to learn that his daughter's move had cost him as much as 3 months' rent had cost her. He wasn't upset about the money. After all, he had slipped her some cash to help out with bills until she figured out how much living on her own would cost. It hadn't been the same when his son, Kevin, had moved out of the house. He, his wife, and Kevin had gone to Wally World one afternoon and purchased everything the boy needed for his place. The next day, Kevin had moved into his apartment, and that was that. The noise level in the house dropped a little, but not much, as Molly had been more socially involved than Kevin. Now, with both kids gone, the house had turned into a mausoleum. No one came running in shouting about good news or disasters. The incessant music blaring from one bedroom was gone. The telephone, ringing at all hours of the day or night, had stilled. To be honest, He had appreciated the peace and quiet for the first month or so. It was nice to sit down and watch an entire movie without interruption. He had enjoyed reading a book in a tranquil environment. He appreciated being able to have a drink at night without fear that he'd be called away for some reason. Planning things without the kids' schedules was refreshing. But then the quiet began to eat at him. He couldn't understand what the problem was. Something was missing, something very important, and he didn't know what it was. A sense of unease gnawed at him, making his temper short. Sighing, he realized that he was getting old. It had crept up on him without him being aware. Yesterday he thought of himself as in his 20s. Today he felt 80. He was becoming the grumpy old man who looked at everything around himself and found that he didn't like it. Ivan finished his coffee and tossed the cup toward a nearby trash can. It hit the edge, but it went in. He raised a fist in a little sign of glory. It was the first little spark of pleasure in his whole day. Continuing his little tour through the mall, he stopped in a small electronics store. It had the usual selection of computers, cell phones, electronic accessories, televisions, and stereos. He paused in front of the stereo systems. There were only 4 different styles of stereos on display. He picked the smallest and least expensive one, thinking that he could get a little music to chase away that depressing silence in the house. Maybe if it wasn't so quiet, he might get rid of that uneasy feeling, although there was a worm of doubt that it wouldn't be that easy. It didn't take long for him to discover that lugging even a small stereo system around the mall wasn't the most pleasant activity in the world. The box was bulky and there just wasn't a good way to hold it. Carrying the plastic bag in the normal manner had the box hitting his knee with each step. Slinging the plastic bag over his shoulder caused the plastic to cramp his fingers. He took his purchase out to his car, getting soaked again from the continuing drizzle. He looked at the entrance to the car, getting soaked again from the continuing drizzle. He looked at the entrance to the mall and didn't feel like taking that hike again. He spent some time in the car waiting for it to warm up before driving off. Actually, he was waiting to warm himself up before driving off. There wasn't much traffic on the road leading away from the mall. He still didn't have a real destination in mind, so he just kept driving. A long drive in the countryside would have been ideal if it had been a nicer day, but he couldn't see that it would be fun trying to make out the landscapes through the drizzle. Driving around in the city traffic wasn't all that much fun either. He was still trying to come up with a destination when he passed a small grocery store, set a little back from the side of the road. His stomach growled, reminding him that it was well after lunchtime, and he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He pulled off the road so that he could turn around and head back towards it. It had been years since Ivan had been inside a little family-owned deli like this. There were a couple of small tables in front of the deli counter. To the side was a small grocery area that provided a small selection of soft drinks, chips, and dessert snacks. It didn't have the kind of variety of products that most convenience stores carried. The overhead fluorescent lights were dim and one of them flickered. Still, it was a nice, clean little place. The guy behind the counter looked to be only a couple years younger than Ivan. He had a ready smile and wrote down Ivan's order. An Italian sub with the works, plus potato chips and a pickle, on a restaurant order pad. Ivan watched the man cut the bread in half, slice the meats and cheeses, load it with lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and peppers before drenching it with the oil and vinegar and finally sprinkling spices over it. He put the sandwich on a plate with a handful of chips and laid a pickle beside the sandwich. It looked delicious. Ivan grabbed a soda from one of the coolers and paid for his lunch. It had been years since he had eaten from one of the coolers and paid for his lunch. It had been years since he had eaten a sandwich made like that. He had gotten the full size, only thinking after the fact that he should have gotten the half. The sandwich was more food than he normally ate for lunch. He carried his plate and drink over to one of the tables. It wobbled when he set the plate on it, so he tried one of the other tables. It was solid. "I've been meaning to fix that table," the man behind the counter said. "What's the problem?" "Parts. I can't get the little foot that screws into the bottom to level it." "That's not a problem. You get a good long bolt that's the right diameter and, if you can't find one with the right thread, tap the holder to fit it. It won't be pretty, but it'll keep the table from wobbling," Ivan said. "To keep the head of the bolt from scratching the floor, He recommended using the plastic top from a soda bottle as a cap on the bolt. No one ever looked under the table to see what made it stable. They only looked when it wobbled. I don't have the tools for that, the man said. I bet you've got a lot of construction crews that pick up lunches here. I'm sure one of the guys has the parts and the tools in the back of his truck. Offer him a sandwich if he'll fix it for you, Ivan said. You seem to know how to do these things. Could you do it? Actually, I'd probably hurt myself if I tried. I'm not all that good with tools. What do you do for a living? I manage properties for people who are too busy to manage them themselves, Ivan answered. Gesturing to the table, he added, I run into a lot of nuisance stuff like that table over there. It costs too much to replace, but you can't get the correct parts to fix it properly. I've got a fellow that I use who is a shade tree mechanic at heart. Ernest can patch up most things like that in a minute. I'd say he's a handy fellow to have around. I'm not all that mechanically inclined, the man said. I could send him around here. I'm sure that in less than an hour, he'd have that table fixed, the fluorescent light replaced, and the cooler over there leveled. How much would that cost? You'd have to work that out with him, Ivan said. If you could send him over here one afternoon, I'd be most appreciative, the man said. Ivan said, I'll do that. I figure this a win-win situation. You need stuff fixed, and he needs a little work. Ivan took a bite out of his sandwich. Tasted as good as it looked. The crust of the bread had just the right amount of hardness, while the interior of the bun had a great texture. The ingredients were fresh and flavorful. The vinegar and oil had covered the lettuce, tomatoes, and onions without soaking into the bun. He was definitely going to come back here. He ate his sandwich watching the owner at work. A few customers came in and purchased sodas and snacks from the market side of the store. It wasn't very busy, not like a corner convenience store. He imagined the guy had plenty of business around lunchtime, particularly during the work week. Between customers, the man spent his time cleaning up the place. It wasn't an overt kind of scrubbing, but an easy wipe of his washcloth here and there while he did other things. There was no buildup of dirt or grim anywhere that required a rigorous application of elbow grease to remove it. Watching him at work, it was obvious that the man took more than a bit of pride in ownership. Ivan finished the sandwich, surprised that he had managed to eat it all, and sat back with a satisfied groan. That was good. Thank you. It's pretty hard to go wrong with an Italian sub. I've gone to that big chain, and I'm often disappointed. That's a chain. You've got to expect that. I guess so. How long have you owned this place? My dad opened this place when I was a little kid. I took it over when he retired 8 years ago. Wow. You don't see many businesses getting handed down father to son like that anymore, Ivan said. Dad had dreams of me going off to college and becoming an engineer. I think he was kind of disappointed that I wanted to work with him. Why would he be disappointed? He's kind of old world. From the old country. He opened this place to provide for his family after immigrating here. I think he wanted a better future for his son than being a shopkeeper. What country did he come from? Hungary. He got out after the Russians invaded Budapest back in 1956. My dad really hated the Russians and communism. He was one of the students who had been protesting communism and helped bring down the government in the revolution. What's that? Ivan asked. A pedophile circle was what they called a group of students who would meet regularly to discuss politics. In particular, they were incensed by the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which basically annexed Poland and the Eastern European countries as satellite countries to the Soviet Union. Those circles formed the core of the protesters who marched on parliament and ultimately brought down the government of Rákosi. I don't know much about that time in history, Ivan said. It was a big deal in its day, Ivan said. I can imagine. By the way, my name is Ivan. I'm Ingo. Ingo? That's an unusual name. My dad named me after Ingo Nagy. He was prime minister of the provisional government that was established after the fall of the Soviet-backed government. He was kind of a moderate and respected by just about everyone. My dad was one of those who felt that Nagy hadn't gone far enough when setting up the provisional government but appreciated that he had taken it in the right direction. Nagy was moving the country towards a multi-party political system and announced that Hungary had withdrawn from the Warsaw Pact. It was a move that cost him his life through an act of treachery. Nagy was killed by the Soviets after they invaded Hungary. They promised him safe passage and then didn't let him pass. Sounds like he was a brave man, Ivan said. I don't know. My dad spoke well of the man, but he didn't know him. Ivan and Ingo talked about history between the infrequent customers. Ivan ended up spending an hour just talking. It was a very pleasant time. It wasn't until Ivan was driving home that he realized he was feeling pretty good. That sense of unease had backed off a bit. He didn't know what to make of it, but he liked how he was feeling. Ingo had been an interesting person, and it had been a nice little chat. It had killed an hour and a half of what had been a long and boring Saturday. He returned to the house. Forgetting that he had purchased the stereo system, he left it in the car. He stopped in the living room to let Samantha know that he had returned. Looking as if she hadn't moved an inch from when he had left earlier, Samantha was still reading her book on her Kindle. She didn't bother to look up when he entered the room. I'm back. Samantha tore her eyes away from her book. Oh, you're back. That's what I just said. There's sandwich makings in the kitchen in case you're hungry. I ate already, Ivan said. That's nice. She returned to her book. Ivan stood there, looking at her, while she appeared to be oblivious to his presence. This awkward exchange had basically summed up their relationship. Ivan wandered through the house looking for something to do. The quiet in the house was almost oppressive. Perhaps it was the thin layer of dust that dampened the noise. Even the little sounds that a house makes, the fan of the heater, the low mumble of the refrigerator, and the moans and groans of the house settling sounded muted. There wasn't the drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet as he had Ernest fixed that months ago. It took about 5 minutes to remember that he had a stereo system in the car. He hauled it in and went through the process of setting it up. The first thing he did while unpacking the stereo was to set the directions aside where they could be safely ignored. Of course, the instructions were unnecessary, and, considering how small the print was, unreadable. All he had to do was plug in the speakers and then plug the stereo into the wall socket. The total time required was less than it took to retrieve the box from the car. He turned on the stereo and found a classic rock station. A slight adjustment to the volume and music filled the room. At least the oppressive silence was gone. Is Molly home? Samantha asked from behind him. No. Oh, I heard the music and… She's not here, Ivan said. Okay, Samantha said. She returned to the living room. Ivan watched her walk off, puzzled by her behavior. That uneasy feeling returned full force. He didn't know what to make of it. He shrugged it off and went over to the computer. He spent the next hour reading what he could about the Soviet invasion of Hungary. It was kind of interesting how few names were mentioned. It was as if people like Ingo's father didn't really contribute to what was an historic event. A few leaders within the interim government were mentioned, but that was about it. He did read a bit about Ingo Nagy. His cell phone rang. A coffee shop in one of the office buildings he managed had a water leak. According to the caller, water had spread into an adjacent office and through the building lobby. The water had been turned off, but he was needed down at the building to decide what to do about the damage. Samantha, I'm reading. The Herald building has a water leak. I've got to check it out, Ivan said while patting his pockets to make sure that he had everything he needed. I'll save dinner for you. Thanks, Ivan said, facing what felt like a never-ending drizzle. Ivan drove off to the office building with his thoughts on what kind of mess he would find once he arrived. His imagination didn't do justice to it. The pipe had sprung a leak the previous evening and had been dumping water onto the floor for nearly 18 hours. It was so bad that water had been running out the front door of the building. In the drizzle, the trickle of water under the door wasn't even noticeable. He spent time on site with the phone to his ear. First, he contacted a water damage company to come out to deal with the water. It was necessary to get the water removed before it caused more problems. The last thing he wanted was mold and mildew. Fixing that would cost a fortune. He knew the folks would show up with the equipment to get up as much water as possible, and then dryers would be used to get rid of the dampness. They'd be pulling water out of the place for the next 48 hours based on how much was there. After he had arranged for the water damage company to come, he called in a plumber to take care of the water leak. The water had been shut off, but an office building could not run without water. The owner of the coffee shop would want to open Monday morning, and that wouldn't happen without water. He then called the owners of the businesses on the first floor and requested them to come out to assess the damage to their businesses. For the next couple hours, he was dealing with angry and upset businessmen. In the midst of all of that, he spent a great deal of time dealing with the insurance company. It was not a very pleasant afternoon and evening. It was well after 10 at night before he able to head home. He passed a restaurant on the way home. He considered pulling in for a meal, then remembered that Samantha had promised to leave something for him to eat. Pulling into the driveway, he could see that the house was dark. He knew it meant that his wife had already gone to bed. She'd been getting up late and going to bed early a lot lately. He entered and went into the kitchen to discover a plate full of some kind of casserole on the counter. He poked at it, trying to figure it out before deciding it was some kind of beef and noodle dish. He looked at the unappetizing meal, wishing that he had given in to the impulse to stop somewhere on the way home for something a little better. It was too late now. He popped it into the microwave and waited for it to heat. He sat on the bar stool at the kitchen counter and ate his dinner. It was a rather bland meal but filling. There had been a lot of it on the plate. He ate as much as he could. He still left a lot on the plate. He emptied the leftovers into the trash can and rinsed off the plate. He didn't know if she had run the dishwasher, so he left it in the sink. After all of the hassles of dealing with the water leak, he wanted to relax a bit before heading to bed. He debated between taking a headache pill or having a drink before deciding to make a simple scotch on the rocks. Carrying his drink, he went into the living room and sat down in a chair. The house was quiet, oppressively so. He sipped his drinking thinking about his day. The trip to the mall wasn't exactly how he'd wanted to spend a Saturday morning. The lunchtime conversation with Ingo had been fascinating, but the guy was just a person he had met. Although the water leak had consumed a lot of his time, it was work and not relaxing. All in all, it was a pretty bad day. He hoped tomorrow would be better. His thoughts turned to what had to be done the next day. He would have to run by the Herald building to see how things were progressing on the cleanup. He wasn't looking forward to Monday morning when all of the people working in the building would come to work to find everything was a mess. He was left with a sense of unease, as if something in his world wasn't right. He couldn't place his finger on it, but some horrible thing was niggling at the back of his mind. He finished his drink and sat there staring off into space. He fell asleep in the chair, woke around 3 in the morning, and made his way to bed. The next afternoon, Ivan returned from the Herald building feeling confident that things would be back to normal there in a day or two. The water had been removed, and the dryers were doing their job. It would take some time for the offices with carpets to dry out, but the tile floors in the lobby area were dry. People would be able to come into the building and get to the offices on the upper floors. The office next to the coffee shop would be out of business for a day since the carpets in it had been totally soaked. He pulled into the driveway, taking note of Molly's car sitting there. He entered the house to find Samantha and Molly chatting at the dining room table. The remains of some pastries were scattered around the table, but he noticed that there was nothing left for him. They had coffee cups that were half full, but it looked like they hadn't been touched in a while. It looked like the two women had been there for several hours at the least. "Hello, Molly. Are you enjoying the independent life?" Ivan asked. "I love it," Molly said. "That's great," Ivan said. "So when? Are you sure that you can't stay for dinner?" Samantha interrupted. "I'm positive. I can broil some chicken breasts," Samantha said. Molly looked tempted, but she replied, "That sounds good, but I've really got to go." "I'd really love it if you stayed," Samantha said. Rising from the table, Molly said, "I'd better go." Samantha rose and followed Molly out of the dining room, talking about future shopping trips, leaving Ivan standing there. With nothing better to do, he picked up the assorted dishes on the table and carried them into the kitchen. He returned with a wet rag and wiped up the crumbs. After pushing the chairs in, he went into the kitchen to take care of the few dishes. When he returned to the living room, Samantha was back to reading her book. She left. Yes. She didn't say goodbye, Ivan said, hurt by his daughter's behavior. I'm trying to read. I can see that, Ivan said. Samantha looked back down at her Kindle. I got out the chicken, Ivan said, irritated at the interruption. Samantha looked up at him and asked, Why? You said you were going to make broiled chicken tonight. We'll just have leftover casserole, Samantha said. I heard you say that you were going to make broiled chicken tonight. We'll just have leftover casserole, Samantha repeated. I heard you say that you'd make broiled chicken, Ivan said, starting to get angry. We're having the leftover casserole. Now if you'll excuse me, I want to finish this book, Samantha said firmly, in her don't argue with me tone of voice. Excuse me? Ivan said, feeling angry at being ignored. He turned and walked out of the house. Again, he was left with nowhere to go. After thinking about it for a minute, he smiled before pulling out of the driveway and heading away from the house. It was a short drive to the restaurant. He went inside like a man on a mission. It was early, and the restaurant was practically empty. The hostess, after leading him over to a table, handed him a menu. He glanced over it, smiled, and then said, I know exactly what I want. Your waiter will be right with you, the hostess said before leaving the table. Ivan watched her walk away, appreciating the nice roll of her hips as she moved. He sighed. Although Ivan knew exactly what he wanted to eat, he glanced over the menu while waiting for the waiter to arrive. The Georgia Peach was one of his favorite restaurants. It was normally too expensive for him except on special occasions. It wasn't the most expensive place in town, but he felt that it was one of the best places to eat in terms of food. The waiter arrived and said, Good evening, sir. My name is Charles, and I'll be your waiter tonight. The hostess said that you already knew what you wanted to order. That's right. I'll have the broiled chicken with garlic sauce and a glass of the house Chablis, Ivan answered. He had selected the only broiled chicken dish on the menu. It came with herb potatoes and steamed green beans. Normally, Ivan didn't like steamed green beans, finding that they were usually just tough little things with almost no flavor. The chef at the Georgia Peach managed to do something. Ivan didn't know what he did to the green beans, but they were his favorite side dish at the restaurant. The herb potatoes they served there weren't bad, either. Would you prefer the garden salad or the spinach salad? The spinach salad, Ivan said. Would you care for an hors d'oeuvre? No, thank you. Ivan handed the menu to the waiter. I'll be right back with your wine, sir. Thank you. It wasn't long before his meal started to arrive. Ivan proceeded to enjoy every bite of food. The wine, he had 2 glasses, was excellent. The hot bread, slathered with a thick coat of soft butter, melted in his mouth. The spinach in the salad had to be the most tender leaves of spinach he had ever tasted. The dressing, he didn't know what kind it was, had a delightful citrus flavor to it. The main dish surpassed his expectations. For dessert, he had coffee and a slice of chocolate cheesecake. After he had finished eating, he relaxed, sipping his coffee and looking around at the others enjoying their meals. He watched a young couple, clearly in love, eating their meal. They were so lost in looking at each other that he doubted they even knew what they were eating. He remembered when he and Samantha were like that. They had been seniors in college when they had met and began the process of falling in love while taking an anthropology class. He was a business major taking the course as a general elective, and she was a history major taking it as a required course. Her father often joked that there were no jobs for historians and that she was actually working on what he called a MRS degree, rather than a Baccalaureate of Arts degree. Her father had an odd sense of humor that Ivan had slowly learned to appreciate. Being college students, money for dates had been a problem, but it wasn't insurmountable. The early dates had them attending university events, with them going to movie presentations on campus, special lectures hosted by various departments, and other campus-based activities. They studied side by side in the library, ate together in the cafeteria, and necked in little isolated corners of the campus. It really didn't matter what they did. They only had eyes for each other. It was a time of excitement in which they nervously expanded the boundaries of their budding relationship and explored their sexuality. By the time they graduated, they were in love, and a few months later they were married. Ivan glanced back at the loving couple sharing their meal and then at the empty chair across the table. Understanding of what had been eating at him crashed down upon him. He now knew what had been bothering him. It wasn't that the house was too quiet. It was that the house was too empty. With the children gone, all emotions seemed to have evaporated. He wondered what had happened to the couple he and his wife had once been. Is this a midlife crisis? He wondered. The idea of going out and buying a sports car wasn't all that attractive to him. He hadn't ever been out cruising for a mistress. That didn't mean that he didn't check out the women. Just that the thought of pursuing one had never crossed his mind. He was married to Samantha and hadn't seen any reason to chase after women. All of a sudden, he felt trapped in an empty marriage. What unnerved him in pursuing that thought was that he suddenly had a reason to chase after women. He nearly spilled his coffee when that thought crossed his mind. The waiter brought the bill over to the table. Ivan paid it without really looking at the amount. If asked later, he would have had no idea how much he had spent on the meal. His mind was on other, more important matters. Ivan drove towards his house. He didn't drive directly home, but stopped along the way at little stores to make a few purchases. Feeling a slight headache, he stopped at a pharmacy and bought a bottle of aspirin. Noticing that his gas tank was nearly half empty, he stopped at the gas station and put 8 gallons of gasoline in his car. His mouth was a little dry, so he stopped at a convenience store and bought a cup of coffee. It was only when he was pulling into a second convenience store to buy a newspaper that he realized what he was doing. He was avoiding going home. He entered the house and made his way into the kitchen. It appeared that his wife hadn't been in there. The chicken he had set out to thaw was still on the counter. The dirty dishes he had stacked in the sink hadn't been put in the dishwasher. He wondered if she had waited for him or hadn't gotten around to making dinner. He wondered if she had even noticed if he had left the house. He went into the living room. Samantha was still seated where she had been when he had left. Her eyes were still glued to the Kindle. "Samantha!" She looked up and said, "I'll reheat the casserole after I finish this chapter." A sudden rage welled up inside Ivan. He grabbed the Kindle from her hand and threw it like a frisbee. It sailed across the room and hit the wall, edge on, leaving a dent before falling to the floor. Samantha, shocked speechless, stared at him open-mouthed. "You're done with that goddamn chapter," Ivan shouted. Samantha just sat there staring at him, wondering what had set him off like that. She hadn't seen him this angry since catching a boy making out with Molly in the living room. The boy had been lucky to leave the house with all his body parts, much less his life. Thinking she would placate him, she said, "Okay, I'll put the casserole in the microwave now. You can take that casserole and shove it up your butt." Realizing that he was about to lose it, Ivan stormed out of the house before he said something he would regret. Samantha, caught completely by surprise, broke out in tears. Monday morning, Samantha woke late, at least for her, feeling like she had the flu. Her nose was stuffed, her eyes were red, her body hurt, and she felt groggy. She hadn't slept well at all. She had lain in her bed, crying for hours before falling asleep. After an hour of sleep, she'd wake and see the empty side of the bed. She'd burst into tears, crying herself to sleep again. It was a cycle that repeated throughout the night. She glanced at the empty place on Ivan's side of the bed and broke out in tears once again. She couldn't believe that he hadn't returned the previous night. She wondered if he would ever return home again. She wished she knew what she had done wrong to anger him so much. The previous night had been a nightmare. In all of the years she had known him, he had never talked to her like that. Maybe it wasn't the best casserole she had ever made, but to tell her to stuff it up her butt? She had cried after he left. After collecting her thoughts, she waited for him to return and apologize to her. When 11 o'clock had come around, she thought that maybe he had gone to a bar to have a drink and calm down. She had tried calling him to tell him to take a cab home. He had ignored her calls. By midnight, she was worried that he had gotten into an accident. She had visions of him lying in a ditch, injured and bleeding. She was still at a loss as to why he had acted the way he had. Losing his temper like that was so unlike him. Even in the worst situation, he was an island of calm. He had no reason to be angry with her. She was sure she had done nothing to make him mad. She put on her robe and went down to the kitchen. Acting on autopilot, she made a pot of coffee. While it was brewing, she dialed his cell phone again. It rang 3 times and then went to his voicemail. It was obvious he was intentionally not answering it. He lived with his cell phone at hand at all times. It seldom rang more than once before he was answering it. If he wasn't answering, it was because he didn't want to talk to her. She poured a cup of coffee and went into the living room. The battered Kindle was on the coffee table where she had put it the previous night. It was only while reaching for it that she remembered that it no longer worked. She was thinking that she'd have to go to the store and buy a replacement. It was while staring at the Kindle that she noticed something disturbing. The coffee table had a coat of dust on it. Shocked, she looked around at the rest of the room. Everything had a coat of dust on it. The carpet was dull and looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in months. Getting up, she walked around the house. There was a stack of dirty laundry in the bedroom. The sheets on their bed looked dirty. She looked in his closet. He had clean shirts hanging crookedly on hangers, but they were wrinkled, as if someone hadn't taken them out of the dryer in time to hang them up before the wrinkles set in. She realized that he must have washed and dried them sometime in the past. The only room that looked halfway clean was the kitchen, although the floor could have used cleaning. Every night, Ivan cleared the table and washed the dishes, feeling like it was his contribution to the housework. He was one of those rare husbands who understood that taking care of 2 kids and keeping up a house was a full-time job. When the kids were babies, he got into the habit of cleaning up after dinner so that she would have a little time to relax. It was a gesture she had initially appreciated, then took for granted, and finally had come to ignore. Although the entire house was a mess, it was in the bathroom where she nearly had a breakdown. The shower walls had patches of black and orange from mold and mildew, except for a round spot in the middle. The mirror over the sink had such a thick film on it that it was hard to see herself in it. There were little stains all over the sink and counter area. Horrified by what she was seeing, she said, "My God!" She didn't even want to look at the toilet. She opened the lid and looked inside, expecting to find a ring in the toilet bowl. Much to her surprise, it was relatively clean. It took a moment for it to dawn on her that every time Ivan took a piss, he was looking into the toilet. He must have gotten disgusted by its appearance at some point in time and cleaned it. Walking like a drunk, she staggered into the living room. She had hardly settled into her chair when the doorbell rang. She went to it with a sick feeling in her stomach. She halfway expected to find some man there, ready to hand her divorce papers. Opening the door, she found herself facing 3 women holding house cleaning supplies. In a thick Hispanic accent that was difficult to understand, one of the women said, "We're here from the morning maid services." If Ivan's disappearance from the house the previous evening had been a blow to the stomach, this was a kidney punch. She knew how Ivan operated. When he had a problem, he called the appropriate people to come in and take care of it. He didn't even have to think about it. He just did it. It was a mode of operation that had made him a successful man. Stunned that he would call a service to clean her house, she backed away from the door to let them in. The 3 women entered the house and looked around. The expression of disdain on the women's faces let her know exactly what they thought of her housekeeping abilities. Embarrassed, she mumbled, "Take care of the living room, dining room, kitchen, and bathrooms." The woman who had greeted her turned to the other 2 women and rattled off instructions in Spanish. It took only a few seconds before all of them were busy cleaning the house. Watching them, Samantha knew that even on her best day, she would never have attacked the work with that much energy. She figured that it would take her days to get done what the 3 women would do in the next few hours. Samantha, near tears, went into the bedroom to get dressed. She wasn't comfortable with the idea of walking around wearing her nightgown and a light robe with a bunch of strangers in the house. She grabbed the first clothes that she found. She didn't notice, but they were the clothes she had been wearing the day before. Once she was dressed, she headed towards the laundry, carrying a load of shirts. Rather than endure the humiliation of watching the women clean her house, she would wash the dirty clothes. While the first load of clothes was washing, she went into the bedroom and started straightening it up. The sound of the vacuum cleaner echoing in the halls sounded like derisive laughter to her ears. She hoped that her children didn't stop by and see what was happening. She'd be mortified. She had always prided herself on being a good housekeeper. She had just stripped the sheets off the bed when the doorbell rang again. She went to the door and found two men standing there. "We're from Hometown Blind and Curtain Cleaners." "Oh," Samantha said. She stepped back and let them in the house. "Our work order says that we're to clean the curtains from the living room, dining room, kitchen, and 3 bedrooms. "That's right," Samantha said, barely able to get the words out of her mouth. She watched them remove the curtains from the large living room window and put them into bags. She wanted to crawl into a gutter when one of the maids smirked at her after pulling a dirty plate out from under the couch. Samantha had no idea how it had gotten there or how long it had been there. Rather than face the maids, she returned to the bedroom. There was enough to be done in there to keep her busy for the whole day. She had barely gotten her hands on the sheets when the doorbell rang again. She stormed through the house and to the door. She opened it to find a small man standing there holding a milk crate filled with tools. He smiled at her. In a thick Eastern European accent that she had never figured out where it came from, he said, "Hello, Mrs. Samantha. I'm Ernest. Mr. Ivan sent me over to patch the wall." "Come in, Ernest," Samantha said. Ernest had been doing odd jobs around the house for more years than she could count. "Thank you, Mrs. Samantha. You can just call me Samantha." "Yes, Mrs. Samantha," Ernest said with a smile. She took him into the living room and pointed out where the Kindle had hit the wall. Ernest smiled at her and then went to work. She headed back to the bedroom knowing that Ernest was one of Ivan's trusted contacts who fixed things that broke. He would show up with his milk crate filled with tools and fix things. She had just gotten the sheets off the bed when there was a knock on the frame of the bedroom door. Irritated at another interruption, she looked over at the man standing there. He shifted uneasily before he said, "I need to get the curtains." "Take them," Samantha said. The man went over to the window and started taking down the curtains. "It's going to be a long day," Samantha said with a sigh. "You're really cleaning up the place," the man said, thinking she was talking about all of the activity taking place in the house. "Yes," Samantha said in a flat voice. "Are you expecting company?" the man asked. "No. I guess you're selling the house then," the man said. "No," Samantha replied sharply, taken aback by the suggestion. "I didn't mean to suggest anything. We don't do much residential work. When we do, it's usually just before visits from in-laws, weddings, or when someone is selling a house." "It's just my husband making a point," Samantha said with a sigh. She glanced at the clock by the bed and saw that it was only 10:30. She wondered who would be showing up next. She had a feeling that, by the end of the day, she was going to know exactly why Ivan was so angry at her. She was terrified that her education had only just begun. "This is the last of the curtains. We'll be back this afternoon with them cleaned." "Thank you," Samantha said. Samantha managed to get the sheets into the washing machine before the doorbell rang again. She came out and answered the door. "Hello, I'm Kevin from At Home Meals." "At Home Meals?" Samantha asked, numbly. "We're a catering service. We prepare meals in advance for busy people. We come to your house and cook the meals. Then we put them into your freezer so that they can be reheated," Kevin said. "That's convenient," Samantha said, trying hard not to scream at the man. "Mr. Morgan hired me to prepare 2 weeks' worth of meals." "Come in, Kevin," Samantha said, staring at the floor, feeling defeated. "I need to bring in the food, my pots and pans." "Take your time," Samantha said. She had gotten Ivan's message loud and clear. Not only was she a bad housekeeper, but she was worthless in the kitchen. She tried to think of what she had cooked over the past few months but couldn't remember. No wonder Ivan had gotten angry when she refused to cook the broiled chicken. He had just been looking forward to a decent meal for a change. The curtain men left with bags full of curtains, promising to return later that afternoon. Ernest had patched the wall and then disappeared out the front door without saying a word. The maids finished cleaning the house a little after 2 and departed. The cook remained in the kitchen until nearly 3, performing the magic of turning fresh food into hot meals. She had eaten a sandwich for lunch while watching him prepare some very good-looking and very healthy dishes. It was almost a shame to see his creations go into the freezer. The aroma was incredible. There had been a time when the aroma of her cooking had filled the air. In the middle of the afternoon, she was convinced that she had received all of her surprise visitors when, much to her horror, a window washer had shown up on the doorstep and had then taken care of the windows. He had done the inside and outside. She had stood there watching him work. He made quick work of each window. He did the whole house in less time than she would have taken to do 3 windows. Shortly after the window washer had left, the men from the curtain cleaners returned. Under her guidance, they rehung the curtains. She had to admit that they looked a whole lot nicer now. She had almost forgotten what colors they were. It took them an hour to get all of the window treatments back in place. The hours of the day had passed slowly, despite how busy it had been. Despite all of the interruptions, she had managed to clean the bedroom and take care of the laundry. The broken Kindle and the chicken breast that Ivan had put out on the counter the previous night had ended up in the trash can. The Kindle by her and the chicken by the chef. He had taken one sniff of it and had made a face of disgust. He had then attacked the whole counter with a bleach and water solution. She looked at the clock. She didn't expect her husband to be home for another hour. That is, if he was even going to come home that evening. She walked around the house inspecting the work that had been performed. She had to admit that it looked a whole lot different than it had that morning. The wood was polished, the floors were clean, the bathroom shined, and even the windows had been washed. Although the pantry remained empty, the freezer was filled with food. There was a salad with grilled shrimp in the refrigerator for that evening. It had only taken 7 people the whole day to accomplish it. The doorbell rang. Dreading what she would find upon answering it, she made her way to the door. Ivan had enough time to visit a lawyer and file for a divorce. She hoped that she wasn't about to be served with divorce papers. A very young and very attractive woman was standing there. Samantha stared at the woman, thinking she looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place where she had met her. The woman looked surprised to see Samantha. After taking a moment to regain her composure, the woman asked, "Is Ivan Morgan here?" "Ivan?" Samantha asked. "Yes, that's the name he gave me," the woman answered. "I don't expect him home for another half hour," Samantha said. She was getting a really bad feeling about this. The woman looked like a sex goddess. Samantha was frantically trying to remember when she had last had sex with Ivan. She couldn't remember. There was no way he could have done something as horrible as sending a hooker to the house. No, he couldn't have. "Would you mind if I come inside and wait for him?" the woman asked. "What is your business with Ivan?" Samantha asked with a definite chill in her voice. The woman said, "Maybe that's not such a good idea. I know this is a little awkward, but I didn't expect his mother to be here." "Mother?" Samantha asked, getting angry. "I should probably come back when he gets home," the woman said. "That might be a very good idea." The woman handed Samantha a business card and said, "Have him call me when he gets here." Samantha glanced down at the card. It said the woman was Candy Lane from Lane Escort Service. She had to read it twice because she hadn't believed it the first time. This was really a low blow. After all of the insults of the day, Samantha lost it. In a shrill voice that carried 2 blocks, Samantha screamed, "Get the hell out of here. If you come back, I'll rip your implants right off of your chest and feed them to you." The woman backed away before turning to head for her car. Samantha, snorting like a bull about to charge, watched the woman drive away. She swore the woman was laughing at her. She sent a 1-finger salute at the woman before storming into the house and slamming the door shut. Fists clenched, she screamed, "I'm going to kill that son of a bitch." She stormed around the house wanting to throw something. Every once in a while, she would stop and scream out her frustration at the top of her lungs. Without saying a single word to her, Ivan had let her know that she was a lousy housekeeper, a lousy cook, and a lousy lover. What really hurt was that she hadn't had a chance to argue or deny the charges. He had proven his point. Energy expended. She collapsed on the couch to wait for him to come home. She wasn't aware of the tears running down her cheeks. Feeling a little calmer, She tried to remember where she had met that woman, but it just wouldn't come to her. She heard the front door open and close. Working up her temper, she waited for him, ready to let him have both barrels. He entered the living room carrying his dry cleaning. She stared at the clothes, feeling her anger slip away from her. Had she sunk so low that he'd had to run all of the errands as well? Sadly, the answer was in his hand. Feeling defeated, she said, "I got the message, loud and clear. I've been a lousy housekeeper, cook, and lover." Ivan asked, "Do we need to see a marriage counselor?" "I don't know," Samantha answered. The thought of a marriage counselor had never crossed her mind. Of course, she hadn't thought about the state of their marriage until last night when Ivan had walked out of the house. It wasn't that she believed they had a good marriage. She just hadn't thought about it at all. For years, her energy was directed at raising the kids and, somehow, Ivan had just become an afterthought. With the kids gone, Ivan had remained an afterthought. "Let me hang up my dry cleaning," he said, lifting the clothes to emphasize the need to put them away. "Go ahead. Would you like me to fix you a drink?" Samantha asked. Surprised by the offer, he answered, "Yes, that would be nice." While he was gone, she made a scotch on the rocks for him, thankful that he was a man of simple tastes. After a couple of minutes, Ivan, having changed out of his clothes, returned to the living room. She handed him the drink. Curiosity forced her to ask, "Who was she?" "Who?" Ivan asked. "Candy Lane. I know her from somewhere." Ivan chuckled, earning a dirty look from his wife. "Kathy Longstreet. You know her. She's the manager over at the Millbrook Apartments." "I knew I recognized her," Samantha fumed. She knew that he couldn't have chosen a better woman to play the part of an escort. Although Kathy was young and beautiful, she also posed no threat to Samantha's relationship with Ivan. Kathy was not straight and had no interest in men at all. If anyone had to worry about being pursued by Kathy, it was Samantha. "I'm sure you would have recognized her girlfriend." "Oh God, don't even bring that up," Samantha said with a groan. At the last Christmas party, Kathy's girlfriend had joked several times about taking Samantha to one of the back rooms to teach her love. Samantha had not been amused when the woman had run a hand over her. Embarrassed, Kathy had dragged her drunken lover away from the party after apologizing profusely. Ivan said, "We had a bit of fun coming up with a fake name for her." Not wanting to hear that he had fun planning her humiliation, she asked, "Why don't you enjoy your drink while I get dinner ready?" "Okay," Ivan said before taking a sip of his scotch. He watched her walk into the kitchen. The house was still too quiet, so he turned on the stereo. He searched for a station until he found one that played classical music. He wanted soft background music rather than classic rock. He sat down on the sofa and thought about Samantha's appearance. He had expected her to be a little better dressed, particularly after Kathy's visit. The fact was, she looked horrible and he knew it was his doing. She looked exhausted. Her face was puffy from crying. She was wearing the same clothes that she had worn the day before. Her hair was a mess. He wondered if she had even brushed it that morning. He knew all about being tired. He had spent a sleepless night in a dump of a motel, wondering how he could fix things at home. He knew that talking wasn't a solution. She was a proud woman and would have been defensive in response to anything he could have said. Nothing would have been accomplished except for hurt feelings after a lot of yelling and screaming, in which each would have said something that couldn't be taken back. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that he had come up with a plan. After a night of almost no sleep, he'd had a busy day. A good part of the morning was spent putting his plan into action while having to deal with the mess at the Herald building. In addition, he'd had to run by the Millbrook Apartments to meet with contractors who were bidding on reshingling the roof of one of the apartment buildings. He took another sip of his drink. Unable to hold it back, he yawned. Lack of sleep, coming down from intense emotions, and the scotch were combining to make him sleepy. "Dinner is ready," Samantha called out. Carrying the rest of his drink with him, Ivan went into the dining room. She had put out the nicest table setting they had, for a change. The salad with grilled shrimp looked excellent. There was a glass of orange juice, which he assumed was a screwdriver, at her place setting. They looked across the table at each other, not knowing what to say. Finally, Samantha said, "Bon appetit." "Same to you," Ivan said. They both tried the salad. It was as tasty as it had looked. They ate without talking. Ivan didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like gloating. He couldn't even compliment the quality of the meal. After all, she hadn't made it. Her pride wasn't going to let her praise a total stranger for a meal created in her kitchen. The silence hung in the air. It forced each of them to think about their situation. Ivan had made his point and felt he had to sit back to see if she had gotten it. Samantha had begun to see just how bad things had been for Ivan. After finishing her meal, Samantha grabbed their glasses and went into the kitchen. She returned after a minute with both glasses refilled. Her orange juice looked like it had been diluted with a substantial quantity of vodka. His scotch on the rocks was mostly scotch and very few rocks. While setting his scotch in front of him, she said, "I feel like I'm supposed to drag you off to the bedroom and let you know how much I love you, but I'm really too tired to do that. I know I would just lie there like a rug. To tell the truth, I'm so tired I'm not sure I could perform," Ivan admitted. He definitely was going to have a problem staying awake if he drank that second scotch. The events of the last 24 hours were really beginning to catch up with him. Samantha said, "I think I'll call a marriage counselor tomorrow and set up an appointment. I'm not dealing too well with the kids leaving the house." "I think that is a good idea," Ivan said, pleased that she was making an effort to rebuild the relationship. Samantha said, "Why don't you take your drink into the living room while I clear the table?" "I usually do the dishes," Ivan said. "It's my turn tonight," Samantha said. She didn't need another reminder that she was doing nothing around the house. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. You've been doing too much of the work around the house lately." Ivan went into the living room and looked at his Kindle. Normally, he'd spend a little time reading a newspaper on it. It was the only way he could keep up with current events. Tonight, he didn't want to touch it, much less read anything on it. In the kitchen, Samantha was rinsing off the dishes and thinking about what had to be done tomorrow. One of the first things she was going to do was go grocery shopping. She had been buying junky, quick-to-fix meals for too long. It wasn't right that they should be eating casseroles from a box, boil-in-a-bag meals, and microwave dinners. It was time that she started cooking real meals again. Food that filled the air with an aroma that increased the appetite and made eating a pleasure. The house wasn't the only thing she had let slide. Her appearance had really gone to hell, and she knew it. She was going to hit a beauty parlor and do something with her hair. She decided that she'd get her nails done while she was at it. She'd also get a new dress. There was no reason for her to be walking around looking like Mrs. Disaster Area without any pots or pans to clean. It didn't take long for her to finish the dishes. She joined Ivan in the living room. She noticed the music for the first time. She was about to comment on the music when Ivan said, "I talked to an interesting fellow Saturday." "Interesting in what way?" His father was a revolutionary in the Hungarian Revolution and had to flee the country when the Russians invaded. He was telling me about some of the stories his father used to tell him. It was really kind of fascinating to listen to him, even though the stories were secondhand. "I never really studied that period in history," Samantha said. "I know. You know, that happened 55 years ago. The folks who participated in it are now in their 70s and 80s. In a few more years, there won't be anyone alive who was involved in that event." "I never thought about it that way. Why are you so interested in history all of a sudden?" "It's just that it got me to thinking. You majored in history in school, and you're always reading historical novels. Did you ever consider going back to school and picking up a master's in history?" "Not really. I'm kind of old to be going back to school," Samantha said, surprised by the suggestion. "You're not old." "Thank you, but I'm not a college kid anymore." "Well, you think about it." He hadn't expected her to immediately agree, but at least he would get her to consider the idea. She had spent the last 24 years as a mother and housewife. With the kids moving out of the house, she had, more or less, retired from the full-time job of being a mother. He thought that going to school would be an attractive option for her. "I will. I'm going to start going to a gym to exercise a little. I realized yesterday that I'm a little out of shape. I could afford to lose 20 pounds or so." I'd like to join you, Samantha said. She took a big gulp of her screwdriver. After the direct assaults on her recent performance as a wife, she appreciated the way he had gently brought up the need to lose weight. Somehow or another, she had become a total mess over the past few months. She had just slipped into becoming a lazy fat slob without even realizing it. She knew that she needed to lose a lot of weight. Her butt had dropped, and a little exercise might tighten it up again. There wasn't too much that she could do with her sagging body, though. Gravity and time were not a woman's friends. That would be nice. Ivan had wanted a nice way to tell her that she needed to lose a little weight and get back in shape. It had dawned on him that, rather than criticize her, he should set himself as an example. He knew that he wasn't exactly a poster child of fitness. The events of the past 24 hours hit Samantha like a ton of bricks. She visibly sagged. Although she wanted to talk some more, she knew that she'd start babbling soon, particularly after the vodka hit her. She said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm exhausted. I'm going to take a shower and get ready for bed." "I understand," Ivan said. "I'm not going to be awake much longer either." He watched her walk toward the hall. He sighed, wondering if things were going to work out between them. He wasn't sure if their marriage was on a sound enough footing. At least he had sounded a warning bell that things were not well. He felt that if they both worked at it, they could save the marriage. He was hopeful that the love and passion that had once been theirs could be rekindled. He swallowed the last of his scotch, rose from the chair, and took the empty glass to the kitchen. He rinsed it out and put it into the dishwasher. The kitchen really looked a whole lot cleaner. He was glad to see that. While closing the dishwasher, he said, "The one great hope of any terrible day is that there's always tomorrow. We'll see what happens tomorrow."